The night in the frontier was silent, yet it carried the weight of secrets that no man dared to speak aloud. The small town whispered of a widow who had lost everything: her husband, her land, her dignity. Forced by circumstance and by the harsh judgment of society, she was handed over to a cowboy who never spoke a word. They called him the Silent Rider, a man whose eyes were as unreadable as the desert horizon. From the moment their fates were tied, a storm of uncertainty hovered, and the entire town wondered what truly lay behind his silence. The air was thick with curiosity, for people knew that silence in the West was never empty. Silence carried scars. It held untold battles. It guarded stories too dangerous to share. The widow, trembling yet unbroken, walked toward her new destiny with eyes that betrayed both fear and defiance. What would happen when a woman who had been silenced by loss was bound to a man who chose silence as a shield? The stage was set for a clash of souls, and every glance was laced with questions no one dared to ask aloud. Her first night under his roof was a prison of unknowns. The wooden walls creaked, the fire burned low, and the weight of his silence pressed on her chest more heavily than any chain. She searched his face for answers, but his gaze remained locked, as if his soul had been buried somewhere out in the desert dust. And yet, something stirred in that silence, something that hinted at danger, at longing, at truths too powerful to stay hidden. Rumors spread faster than prairie fire. Some claimed he had killed men with his bare hands. Others whispered he had taken a vow after seeing horrors no heart could bear. But no one truly knew. And as the widow lay awake, watching the shadow of the cowboy by the fire, she felt a pull, a haunting sensation that his silence was not emptiness, but a prison door barely holding back a flood. Then, as the first night deepened, the impossible happened. His eyes, those cold, unreadable eyes, shifted and opened in a way no one expected. In that moment, the silence cracked, and what she saw in his gaze was enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about survival, about love, and about the dangers of a heart bound to secrets in the ruthless land of the Old West. The morning after their union, the widow woke to a silence heavier than any storm she had ever faced. The cabin was simple, yet every creak of the wooden boards seemed to echo with his unspoken presence. He moved with the steadiness of a man carved from stone, each gesture deliberate, yet stripped of warmth. She studied him with careful eyes, searching for a sign of humanity behind the rigid posture and the stillness of his face. In the Old West, silence could be a shield, but could also be a weapon, and she had no way of knowing which one he carried. The townsfolk had warned her. They said a man who carried no voice must surely carry a past too dark to reveal. Yet, as she observed him, she saw discipline rather than cruelty in his silence. He fed the horses with steady hands, chopped wood with precision, and worked the land with a focus that left no space for idle chatter. And though his mouth never opened, his eyes, those piercing eyes, followed everything, absorbing every detail of the world around him. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, but also the eyes of one who missed nothing. The widow, used to the lively hum of her late husband's voice, now found herself lost in the void between words. It unsettled her, but it also awakened something unexpected: curiosity. Every silence became a question. Every movement became an answer half revealed. And though she feared what might lie behind his quietness, she could not resist the pull of mystery. The ranch, once foreign, was quickly becoming a stage where two wounded souls tested the boundaries of survival, trust, and perhaps something deeper. At night, when the desert winds howled against the wooden walls, she listened for any sound he might make, an involuntary murmur in sleep, a sigh, anything that would prove he was flesh and blood and not just a phantom walking the earth. But he gave her nothing. His silence was complete, almost sacred, and it kept her awake long into the night. It was in those hours of restless waiting that she began to understand that his quiet was not weakness, but a fortress, and that fortress had been built brick by brick with pain she had yet to uncover. Still, there was one undeniable truth: silence could not last forever. In the Old West, secrets had a way of surfacing like buried bones after a storm. And though the widow did not yet know what haunted the cowboy, She sensed with every passing day that his silence was a fire waiting for the right spark to ignite. And when it did, it would either burn them both or reveal something powerful enough to change everything. The days stretched on, and the harsh rhythm of the frontier gave the widow little time to dwell on fear. Life demanded her strength. She rose before dawn, fetching water, tending to the animals, and mending what the rugged land tore apart. The cowboy worked beside her, silent as always, yet his presence was undeniable. Where once she felt abandoned, now she felt watched, not by suspicion, but by an unseen tether binding them in a fragile, wordless bond. Every shared task was a conversation without words, every passing glance an unspoken dialogue of survival. The townsfolk gossiped relentlessly. Some pitied her, believing she had been cursed to share her life with a man who spoke less than the wind. Others whispered that she was safer than any woman in the territory, for no outlaw dared test the wrath of the silent cowboy. They said he had once faced 5 armed men alone and left them scattered like shadows before dawn. They said his silence was not born of weakness, but of power too dangerous to unleash. Whether myth or truth, the widow carried those stories with her, torn between dread and awe. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she saw him seated by the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes. His face was lit by the flames, and for the first time, she dared to study him openly. The lines etched into his skin spoke of years lived in hardship, of battles fought under unforgiving skies. His silence, she realized, was not emptiness but control, an iron will that refused to let words betray him. She wondered if the same will that kept his mouth closed also kept his heart locked away. The widow's own heart was restless. She had lost love once, and now she found herself bound to a man who gave her nothing but his shadow. Yet, despite herself, she began to feel a strange kind of safety in his silence. Unlike others, he never judged, never mocked, never burdened her with false promises. He simply existed, steadfast as the desert rocks. And perhaps in that quiet constancy lay a truth she had long sought. Perhaps she had not been given to him by fate as a punishment, but as a test. On the 5th night, as the coyotes howled in the distance, she woke to find him standing at the window, eyes fixed on the dark plains. His hand hovered near his gun, his body tense, as if expecting danger. And then, for the first time, his lips parted, not in speech, but in the faintest whisper, a sound so fragile it barely reached her ears. It was not a word, not yet, but it was enough to crack the wall of silence and leave her trembling with the realization. The silent cowboy's voice had not been lost. It had only been buried. The whisper haunted her. Though it had been no more than a breath, it lingered in her mind with the weight of a secret. She dared not ask him about it, fearing the fragile thread might snap if she pressed too soon. Yet she could not deny that moment changed everything. Suddenly, his silence was not an endless void, but a veil, thin, trembling, waiting to be torn aside. She found herself watching him more closely, searching his every movement for the promise of more. The cowboy, however, carried on as though nothing had happened. His days were filled with the relentless demands of the land, roping strays, repairing fences, and keeping the ranch alive in a world where survival was never guaranteed. But even in his silence, something had shifted. His glances lingered a heartbeat longer. His steps, once cold and detached, now seemed to match her rhythm as they worked side by side. The unspoken grew louder than any spoken word, weaving a fragile connection that neither dared acknowledge aloud. The widow began to recall the first time she had been forced to marry, how her late husband's voice had been a constant thunder, filling every room with laughter, anger, and command. Compared to that, the cowboy's silence felt unbearable, yet strangely comforting. It was as if she had stepped from a storm into a still canyon, where echoes waited to be discovered. The contrast tore at her heart, leaving her caught between grief for what she had lost and curiosity for what she might yet gain. Whispers of the past clung to him like dust. At the market, old men nodded at his shadow and hushed their voices when he passed. Children pointed, but quickly looked away when met by his piercing gaze. No one dared confront him, but the weight of their rumors reached her ears, tales of a massacre, of a betrayal, of a vow of silence forged in blood. Each story contradicted the last, yet all carried the same warning. His silence was not born of choice alone, but of tragedy. And so the widow found herself torn between fear and compassion. She had been bound to him by force, but now her heart leaned forward, reaching through the cracks of his silence. What pain, she wondered, could seal a man's voice so tightly? And more importantly, what would happen when the day came that he could no longer hold it inside? That night, the desert carried storm. Thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the windows, while lightning split the sky like the crack of a whip. The widow sat by the fire, her hands trembling, as the cowboy stood guard at the door, eyes fixed on the horizon. It was in the storm's fury that she felt his presence most acutely, not as a stranger, but as a shield. He did not speak, yet every line of his body promised protection. And though his silence frightened her, it also steadied her, like the calm eye at the center of chaos. When the rain finally poured, she saw him move to cover the horses, his body soaked through with mud and water. She rushed to the door, ready to protest, but stopped when she saw his silhouette illuminated by lightning. He was a figure of solitude, carved by suffering, yet unbroken by it. In that instant, she realized his silence was not weakness but endurance, the kind only earned by those who had faced hell and returned standing. The sight filled her with both sorrow and respect, and for the first time, her fear of him softened. Hours later, when the storm had calmed, he returned inside, dripping wet but unshaken. She brought him a blanket, her hand brushing his as she handed it over. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers, and the weight of his silence shifted. It was no longer a wall. It was a plea she could not yet understand, but one she could feel deep within her chest. As dawn broke, she found herself remembering the whisper she had heard that night by the window. It had not been clear, but she now believed it was not meant for her at all. It had been meant for someone else, someone from his past. That realization sent a shiver through her. Whoever haunted him was still alive in his silence, buried deep within his heart. And with that thought came a truth she could not ignore. The day his silence broke would not simply be a moment of release. It would be a reckoning. For both of them. The widow could not escape the unease that grew with each passing day. His silence no longer felt like distance alone. It felt like a storm building beneath the earth, trembling just out of sight. She moved through her daily tasks with measured care, stealing glances at him as he mended fences or rode out into the desert. Every action he took was precise, controlled, and deliberate. Yet the air around him felt heavy, as though one wrong step might awaken something dangerous. At the general store, whispers followed her. One woman leaned close and murmured that the cowboy's silence had begun after a night of bloodshed, when an ambush had left men screaming in the dirt and him standing alone. Another insisted he had once loved a woman whose life was stolen before his eyes, and that his silence was his vow to never let the world hear his grief. The widow listened, but none of the stories satisfied her heart. They only deepened her longing to know the truth hidden behind those unyielding eyes. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in streaks of fire and ash, she set a plate before him and dared to ask a question. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "What is it you see when you close your eyes?" she whispered, hoping the storm outside might hide her boldness. For a moment, she thought he would remain mute, as always. But then, his gaze locked with hers, burning with something unspoken, something too powerful for words. He said nothing, yet she felt the answer in her bones. He saw ghosts. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, it brought dreams that unsettled her. She dreamed of a battlefield, of shadows rising from the sand, of voices screaming but never heard. She woke in a cold sweat to find him sitting by the fire, staring at the flames as if they might consume him whole. His silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like exile, a punishment he had chosen for himself. And still, she stayed. Though fear whispered for her to flee, though reason told her she was bound to a stranger, something stronger held her there. Perhaps it was pity, or perhaps it was fate. But deep within, she knew her life had crossed and it was not by accident, but by some greater design. The silent cowboy story was not yet finished, and neither was hers. The following week brought unease to the town. A gang of riders had been seen near the outskirts, their lawless laughter echoing through the canyons. Folks whispered of cattle theft, of barns burned, and of men found beaten along the trails. Fear gripped the townspeople, but their whispers always ended with the same words: "They won't touch the silent cowboy's land." His reputation alone was enough to keep danger at bay, until now. One afternoon, as the widow hung linens on the line, she saw him watching the horizon with unusual intensity. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his jaw tight, his body still as stone. She followed his gaze and saw dust rising in the distance, riders approaching. Her breath caught, and for the first time, she realized that his silence was not only for himself. It was a warning to the world. The riders passed that day, their laughter fading into the wind, but the air remained charged. That night, the widow sat near him by the fire, the silence between them heavier than ever. She thought of all the stories she had heard, of all the rumors that painted him as a man of violence, of grief, of unbroken will. And though she feared what might come, she also felt a strange certainty. If danger reached their door, he would stand. Silent, perhaps, but unyielding. She wanted to speak, to tell him her fears, to ask him if the stories were true. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she offered a gesture, her hand placed gently on the table between them, close enough to bridge the space if he chose. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, slowly, his fingers brushed hers, not with passion, but with a silent acknowledgement. She was no longer alone in this. And so the widow understood something vital. His silence was not the absence of connection. It was his way of protecting it, guarding it like the last ember of a dying fire. And though he had yet to speak, though his story remained locked within him, she now believed that when his voice returned, it would not come as a whisper. It would come as thunder. The days that followed were tense, each sunrise carrying the weight of unspoken fears. The widow noticed how the cowboy's eyes no longer rested calmly on the horizon, but scanned it with the precision of a hawk. His silence had sharpened, becoming more than habit. It was readiness. She began to realize that the world outside their cabin was closing in, and when it did, his silence would either protect them or destroy them. One evening, as dusk settled and shadows stretched long, the widow prepared supper in uneasy quiet. The cowboy sat nearby, sharpening his revolver with movements slow and deliberate. She wanted to break the silence, to ask if he expected a fight, but something in his expression stopped her. His gaze was distant, like a man already standing on a battlefield only he could see. She understood then. Silence was his armor, and once broken, it would unleash the storm within him. The town grew restless. Men whispered in saloons. Women pulled their children inside earlier than usual, and every face seemed etched with dread. The gang had been seen again, closer this time, circling like wolves testing the strength of their prey. And still, the widow noticed how no one dared speak the cowboy's name too loudly. His silence had become legend, a promise of violence too terrible to imagine. That night, the widow lay awake, listening to the sound of his boots pacing the floor. Each step was steady, controlled, yet heavy with anticipation. She realized that while she feared the gang, she feared even more what might happen when the cowboy finally chose to break his silence. Would he become her protector, or reveal himself as something darker, something forged in blood and vengeance? As dawn broke, she watched him saddle his horse. His silence was unchanged, but his eyes burned with a clarity that made her breath falter. He had chosen his path, and whatever it held, she would be bound to it. The question was no longer whether he would speak, but what his first true words would unleash upon them all. The silence between them grew unbearable. The widow, desperate for answers, found herself speaking more often, even if only to fill the void. She told him of her late husband, of the weight of widowhood, of the night she thought grief would swallow her whole. He never responded, not with words, but sometimes his eyes softened, and that was enough to keep her talking. Perhaps, she thought, her voice could reach where silence had buried him. But the truth pressed heavier with each story she told. She began to realize that his silence was not only about pain, it was about control. Control over memories too sharp, over emotions too dangerous, over truths that could cut like steel. And the more she understood this, the more she longed to shatter it, to know the man beneath the silence, no matter the cost. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the plains in blood-red light, she finally dared to confront him. "Why won't you speak?" she asked, her voice trembling but unyielding. For a moment, he froze, his body rigid as stone. Then his gaze met hers, filled with something raw, something unbearable. But no words came, only silence, deeper than before, as though her question had driven him further into exile. She felt her heart ache, torn between anger and pity. Her life had been bound to a man who would not let her in. Yet she sensed that behind his silence was a truth that connected them more deeply than words ever could. Still, the weight of that truth threatened to crush her. She wondered if perhaps it was better never to know. But fate, as the West had always proven, does not allow silence to endure forever. The world outside their cabin was moving closer, and the storm she had long feared was no longer just in his heart. It was on the horizon, waiting for the moment when silence would be forced to break. The widow woke to the sound of horses in the distance. At first, she thought it was a dream, the echo of hooves pounding through a restless sleep. But when she looked out the window, she saw the dust rising, 5 riders moving like shadows against the pale morning light. Her heart froze. The gang had come, and their silence was not like her husband's. It was the silence of predators before the kill. She turned to the cowboy, who was already standing by the door, rifle in hand. His face betrayed nothing, yet his eyes told her everything. He had been expecting this. Every night spent awake, every step across the floor, every watchful gaze into the horizon had been leading to this moment. The widow felt fear claw at her chest, but when she looked at him, she also felt something else, certainty. He was a man born to stand at the edge of danger. The riders slowed as they approached, laughter rolling through the air like thunder. One called out, mocking, demanding tribute for safe passage. The others grinned, their hands resting casually on their weapons. They thought they had cornered prey, but the widow saw the shift in the cowboy's stance. His silence was no longer a cage. It was a loaded gun, waiting for the trigger. The widow wanted to beg him not to fight, to plead for peace, but the words stuck in her throat. She realized then that silence had become their language, and in that silence, she understood his answer. This was not about choice, it was about survival. And survival in the Old West never came without a price. As the riders dismounted, circling like wolves, the widow's breath caught. The cowboy's hand brushed against his revolver, and in that instant, she knew. When he finally broke his silence, the sound would echo louder than the desert thunder. The standoff stretched, the air so heavy it seemed the land itself held its breath. The gang jeered, tossing threats and insults, but the cowboy stood unmoved, his silence striking them harder than any words could. The widow clutched the edge of the doorframe, torn between terror and awe. She realized that in this silence lay the weight of his legend, the reason men feared him, the reason no one dared cross his shadow. One rider stepped forward, sneering, hand resting on his pistol. He spat in the dust and demanded the widow be handed over his payment. Her heart stopped, her body frozen, but the cowboy didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his gaze, and for the first time, the widow saw his eyes blaze with unrestrained fire. It was not rage alone, it was a vow she suddenly understood he had carried in silence all this time. Then, the silence shattered. His voice, low and jagged from years of exile, cut through the air like a blade. Not her. The words were few, but they carried the force of storms, the weight of graves, the promise of death to anyone who dared take another step. The gang faltered, stunned by the sound that few living men had ever heard. The widow trembled, not from fear of him, but from the power of his voice. It was the sound of a man who had buried his words in blood and grief, a man who had chosen silence because the world was not ready for the weight of what he carried. And yet, he had broken that vow, for her. The riders shifted uneasily, their bravado cracked by the force of 2 words. And in that fragile moment, As the desert wind howled around them, the widow understood the truth. The silent cowboy was silent no longer, and the world would never be the same. The story of the silent cowboy reminds us that silence is never empty. Behind his stillness lived memories too painful to speak, but also strength too profound to deny. His journey with the widow was not only about survival in a ruthless land, it was about finding the courage to break through walls built from grief, to allow his voice to return when it mattered most. It shows us that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for redemption. The widow's strength was not in her defiance alone, but in her willingness to stay when fear whispered for her to flee. Through her, we learn that love and resilience often bloom in the most desolate places. Her patience carved a path through his silence, reminding us that connection does not always come through words. It often arrives in the quiet, steady presence of those who refuse to give up. When the silent cowboy finally spoke, the world trembled because it understood the weight of his silence. His voice became a testament that words, when carried by truth and sacrifice, can change everything. It is a reminder for us that sometimes silence protects, but eventually, every heart must choose to speak, to defend what matters, and to reveal the truth it has guarded. This tale is more than an Old West story. It is a mirror of our own battles. How often do we bury our voices, hiding behind silence out of fear, grief, or shame? And how often do we forget that the moment we choose to speak, to rise, to stand, we alter the course of our destiny? The silent cowboy teaches us that silence can hold power, but breaking at the right moment can define who we truly are. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What did the silent cowboy's silence mean to you? And if you wish to continue exploring powerful stories of the Old West, subscribe to the channel and join us for more. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart, because every story is kept alive when it is remembered, retold, and felt together.